Hello. So welcome everybody. So we are live from Cambridge Innovation Center in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm Ludivine Wolksik. I'm the Executive Director of the French-American Chamber of Commerce of New England. And today we are very welcome to welcome our partner from Fragomen, Brian Doyle, Amanda Hayes, and Alexandra Brunsberg, who are going to give us an update about the immigration law in the US. We have a few people that are participating here in person in Cambridge. And for those of you who are numerous participating online, you are more than welcome to ask your questions using the chat. Thank you very much. And Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you everyone for coming. This is the first time since really 2020 I've been out talking to folks in person and giving a presentation in person, so we're excited to do that here. And thanks everyone who's joining online at lunchtime or dinner time, depending on where you are in the world. So we're excited to talk to you about sort of what's going on in the US immigration sphere. Some updates, we'll give you some information I think will be helpful to a lot of folks that are out there. And again, excited to be joined by my two colleagues here as well. So jump right into it. I want to see first if I can get our presentation up on the screen, and then we'll go from there. Right, perfect. So again, my name is Brian Doyle. I'm a senior associate at Fragomen, and we sort of have an all-star team here. We have Amanda Hayes, also a senior associate, and Alexandra Brunsberg, third senior associate. So there's a lot of knowledge at this table, mostly from the two of them. I'm excited to share all of that with you as well. I think really where I want to start in this discussion, and again, like was said in the great introduction, if you have questions, throw them in sort of the chat box. We're happy to address the questions that we can over here. Folks that are here in person as well, certainly we'll have some time afterwards to answer the questions that we can. But where I would like to start our discussion is, we typically see two different sort of types of folks that are looking to sponsor nationals in the United States. It's very often going to be companies that are based outside of the United States, somewhere in the EU, that is looking to get a foothold in the US. And how do I get my talent into the US? What type of options exist to get this talent into the US? I want to get into the US market. How can I go about doing that? And the other tends to be those that are already here in the United States. They have a presence in the United States. Maybe they don't have a presence outside the U.S. But here we are in Cambridge. We have a dozen schools, students thrown away, and a lot of great talent coming out of the university system in the Boston area as well. So just to start with you, Alexandra, can you tell us a little bit about what type of various visa options are available in these two types of scenarios for employers?
Sure, I would love to. So there's a whole alphabet soup of different visa options. I'll start with if you already have an office outside the United States and maybe you're trying to get a foothold in the United States, or maybe you started up something in the United States. If you have more than one office, right? One outside of the United States, one inside the United States. You can do something called an L1. It's for intra-companies transferees. This is a really good way to transfer your existing employees that are outside the United States into the United States. The qualifications for the L1 there's two types. There's either your managers or executives that you can transfer over to the United States, or folks who have specialized knowledge. For your managers, they could be people managers, but they don't necessarily have to be. They could manage in a really important function. So say, for example, you have an HR manager, maybe they don't have direct reports, but HR is a really important function of the organization. So you can say they're a functional manager and try to transfer them over. Somebody with specialized knowledge is somebody that has a unique expertise of your company. Maybe they've been an employee with you for a long time. They know your software, your practices, maybe your marketing strategies, things like that, and they're really important to your company and you want to transfer them over. For each of these employees, they have to be employed at least 1 year with your company outside the United States before you can transfer them in. And the L1, it's actually a really great option because even if you're just starting out, maybe in the United States, maybe you're just a startup, maybe you've just signed a lease and you're getting the ball rolling, there's an option for something called new office Ls, where maybe you're not, fully in business yet, but you can still transfer people over. And then as your business gets rolling, you can continue to show evidence of how your business has grown. So L1, great option for international transfers. That's just a quick summary. There's lots of ins and outs about it, but that's really the main option for international locations. If you don't have an office outside the United States, there are still plenty of other options. One that can be really popular for European countries if you're looking to start a business in the United States is the E2. It's for treaty and investors. So what it basically means is you are investing in a business in the United States. It has to be a substantial, not a nominal type of investment. There's no numeric number, but usually when we're a lawyer and we're looking to see is this a viable case, we'd like to see at least around 100,000 in investment, and that can be maybe you've signed a lease, maybe you've done some marketing research, maybe you've traveled to the United States for trade shows. All of those kinds of things can be added into the investment. And once you there's this process called E2 registration. You basically register your company. It has to be one of a treaty trader countries. So not every country qualifies, but a lot of the European ones that are French speaking do qualify. So France, Belgium, Luxembourg, they're all on the list. The company has to be owned at least 50% by a person or business of that country. So it has to be like a French-owned company or a Luxembourg-owned company, something like that. And the people that you're transferring over, they could either have some kind of special knowledge, maybe they have some really unique skills that you'd like to bring over. The alternative would be maybe they're in some kind of supervisory role. It's a nice option because there's no limit. Once you can show your investment and the people that you want to bring over, it's approved for 2 years, and then they can just keep renewing it in 2-year increments because there's no cap. So you can, it's a good way to hire people for long term. You can't pursue a green card on this. You can eventually change to some other status, but it's a good way to have people from abroad come in and work in the United States for a substantial amount of time and grow your business. The next one that we could talk about is the J1. So there are a million kinds of J1s. J1 is really to promote cultural exchange. So it's to show that there's an exchange of information and expertise and culture between multiple countries. The most common types of J1s are for interns and trainees. So interns, that's something that you'd really use for recent graduates. They have to be either a university student or somebody who has graduated within the year from a school outside the United States. So this is someone that you'd bring on for an intern. It can be up to 12 months. If you have somebody that's a little bit further along in their career, you can do a trainee. That's for 18 months. And this is a person who's gone to the school outside of the United States, and then he either has a year of related experience, or if they've never gone to school, they have to have 5 years of related experience. And that's just for 18 months. You go through a sponsor, the government sponsor. So there are basically organizations out there that will help you with the J1 application. FACCNE is actually a sponsor, so they assist with transferring people over and helping them with their internship and their training programs. So really good for folks to just who want to just get some training experience in the United States, get some of that international exposure. Sometimes eventually they'll transfer on to different visa types if they want to stay here for a longer term. But so it can be a path to longer term if you switch over to another option, but also just good for the short term. Sometimes we'll see that companies will do it on a rotating basis too. Maybe they want people in their office abroad to just get some exposure and then go back to their home country. If you're in biotech, another good option for the J1 is there's a J1 researcher. So if you have a role where this person's going to be doing research, maybe they have their PhD, something like that, the J1 researcher is good for 5 years. So, a lot of research companies in and around Boston will use this option to bring over someone on a research program. And then, if they want to stay, they can eventually switch over. And then last, I'll speak about is the H-1B, which is like the most common visa. And I'll have Amanda talk about that because there's so much to say there.
Sure. So the H-1B is a visa for individuals in a specialty occupation. We think of it as one of the bread and butter visa classifications for folks who want work authorization in the United States. The biggest drawback to the H-1B is that there's a limited number of them available every year. And we'll talk about that process in the lottery in a moment. But the sort of substance of an H-1B is for folks who are working in a specialty occupation. And so that's going to be an occupation that requires a bachelor's degree in a specific field of study. So not any old bachelor's. Think of, someone who is going into, a software engineering role. They should have, a related degree in something like computer science. And the role needs to require that of the applicant, of the employee. There is, if the individual doesn't have a bachelor's degree, there's a way to equate work experience to educational experience. The formula for that is that every 3 years of work experience equates to 1 year of a 4-year degree program. So someone with no coursework at all would need 12 years of work experience in a related profession to get to that equivalent of a bachelor's degree. So the position itself needs to require the degree in a specialized field, and the individual has to hold the credentials. For an H-1B, to move on to an H-1B for someone who's never held one before, you need to be selected in the annual H-1B lottery. And that's really the biggest sort of hurdle to getting someone into H-1B status for the most part, is that there are 85,000 H-1Bs available every year. So 65,000 in the standard, what we call regular cap, and then 20,000 for individuals who hold an advanced degree from a U.S. institution. So that's important. H-1Bs have a maximum stay of 6 years, so there are limited ways to extend beyond 6 years, but for folks from most European countries, it'll be a 6-year max, and then you'll need to be able to move on to a green card. It is very, it's relative, it's easy from sort of a intention perspective to move from an H-1B to a green card. All the visa classifications we've been talking about so far today are non-immigrant visas. That means temporary visas to come and stay in the US temporarily. And most of the other ones we've touched on so far today, with the exception of the L, are purely non-immigrant visas, which means it's trickier to move onto a green card eventually. Not impossible, but trickier. The H and the L are dual intent, which means that somebody who holds an H or an L can have the full intention to become a green card holder with no issue, and sort of travel freely on their H-1B while they're in green card processing, and it's completely understood that those folks are able to have the intention to do both things at once. A couple of great things about the H-1B if an individual is selected, and we'll talk about the lottery in a moment, but there is, dependents are going to be in H-4 status, and if you've reached a certain phase of the green card process, your spouse in H-4 can seek work authorization. We're going to talk about dependent work authorization as sort of a whole separate section after we discuss green cards, but that's another advantage of the H-1B. And then, of course, the biggest drawback of the H-1B, which is the lottery and the quota. Because there are those limited numbers available in any given year, and there have been more folks seeking H-1Bs every year in the recent past. So there was a time, not in all of our practice, when the 85,000 was not reached. So folks were applying sort of throughout the year for H-1Bs. It's now been the case for many years in a row where there are more folks applying than there are visas available in the government's fiscal year.
Yeah, so, and just to pause right there too. So we basically have what we call the H-1B cap. And cap is basically the limit on how many H-1B visas can be given out every year. And H-1B tends to be by far the sort of most well-known, most popular of these sort of temporary non-immigrant visa types. Also because unlike the L1, you don't have to have an office outside the United States. Unlike the E2, you don't have to have a predominantly French-owned or UK-owned business be transferring folks into the US. So there is a high demand for it. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that there's a lottery every year because of this high demand. And that lottery basically takes place at the end of March. So for employers interested in sponsoring someone for H-1B status, now's the time to be thinking about that. Who do you want to sponsor for H-1B status? And getting to be registered for the upcoming lottery. The registration period is basically the first 2.5 weeks of March. So it is sort of crunch time for most types of H-1Bs. You do have to enter the lottery. Otherwise, you're waiting a whole another year before you can sponsor folks for that visa type. And Amanda just alluded to it, but we are seeing sort of crazy demand beyond what this annual limit is. So we're going to go through the data right now. But Amanda, I'm also curious, it is the most sort of desired, the most common, or the most used sort of temporary work visa type. But as we look at this data, can you also walk us through sort of what other options might exist beyond the H-1B?
Yep.
Even if even if an employer is out there saying, I want to sponsor this, candidate for H-1B status, you'll see in a second you have about a 1 in 4 chance of even being selected in the lottery. So then it's okay. Now what do we do? And we'll talk about what those options.
Yeah, and so one of the reasons that you have so much demand for H-1Bs right now is it's a really common option for folks who are coming out of school in the United States, right? Who are graduating and are maybe in, F1 student status. They're in a period of work authorization after they graduate. They're seeking to get onto that H-1B. They maybe don't have that year of employment with the company that they're wanting to be employed by, abroad or things like that. They don't qualify for the L. So you see sort of a lot of demand for graduates in the H-1B, and you also see all of the categories that we talked about previously. You see folks wanting to move perhaps from an L or an E2 or a J1 into H-1B. So there's a lot of demand there, right, from folks who are already in other non-immigrant status, or for folks who are coming out of university programs and looking for those first jobs. And I think one of the things that's driven up demand, I think we'd all be in agreement on this, is that there was a change in the government's process for conducting the annual H-1B lottery. It's immediately as the pandemic was beginning. So we're going into our 4th season of it. And so it used to be that come the beginning of April, the government issues H-1Bs based on government fiscal year, which starts in October. And it was always that you could apply for an H-1B starting 6 months prior to the beginning of that fiscal year. So April 1st was the magic date. And we used to all get our H-1B petitions ready and send them off to the government the first week of April. And they would conduct the lottery based upon all of the petitions that they received in that first week. Beginning in 2020, so for the fiscal year 2021, they rolled out a new H-1B registration system, whereby in the month of March, or the latter half of March, the first half of March, they would accept registrations from companies who were seeking to enter their employees into the lottery. Very bare bones information, just sort of like name, date of birth, some basic information, the company that was sponsoring, and the government collects all of that information in sort of that first couple of weeks of March, and then conducts the lottery at the end of the month and lets companies know who's been selected, and then allows you to actually file the substantive H-1B petition with the government. The fee for that has been relatively low, in the realm of USCIS fees to register. And so we've seen the numbers go way up in terms of the number of folks being entered into this lottery. I think that the barriers to entering are just lower and lower. In that instance, you're not paying full government fees or full lawyer fees to put the entire H-1B petition together. So as a result, last year we saw nearly 500,000 registrations for the 85,000 slots. That's a 57% increase from the prior year, and it rendered about a 31% selection rate. It's a 26% overall selection rate in last year's CAP, which is a drastic reduction from what we had seen in prior years. So, if you're going back to the numbers for the first couple of years for the new system even. You look at the first year that we had the new system, we had just under 300,000 registrations, just about 300,000 registrations in fiscal year 2022. And then we saw that huge increase last fiscal year. So what we're seeing when the number of registrations go up, that's going to reduce result in a reduced selection rate. And that means that folks are left in a situation where they're saying, well, what are my options if not the H-1B, right? And so if you have, folks who are in a situation where they're not selected in the H-1B lottery, they don't qualify for some of the other visas that we've already talked about today, what you start to look to is, well, we can talk about the O1, and we were touching on this sort of as we were chatting here before the presentation got rolling. The O1 is, it's going to be an option for a relatively small subset of people. It's a visa for individuals with extraordinary ability. So it's going to be self-limiting by its nature. But it is, something certainly worth looking at for folks who are at the very top of their field. So the O1 is a visa for individuals of extraordinary ability in sciences, education, arts, business, or athletics. There are different standards of eligibility based upon which category you're seeking. So whether it's sciences, education, business, and athletics, or whether it's in the arts or motion pictures or TV. And what you're looking for is if someone is really and truly at the very top of their field. So it's going to be a rigorous adjudication process for this visa classification, very strict criteria that are outlined from the government on how to qualify, but certainly worth looking at if you have somebody who's just, truly extraordinary, truly outstanding in their field. The O1 is definitely something that you want to look at. In terms of options beyond non-immigrant status. So if the O is not going to be a fit for somebody, perhaps you have a very recent graduate who just hasn't had the time to sort of ramp up and develop the credentials that you would look to for an O, we start looking at green card based sponsorship. So and every company is going to have different parameters around when they sponsor for a green card, when they're willing to go through this process. But this is, immigrant visa processing, whereas we've been talking about non-immigrant visas, temporary ability to work and remain in the U.S. Green card would be, seeking permanent residency in the United States. Someone wants to live and work here for the long haul. Most employment-based green card processes are going to go through a 3-step process. We'll talk about the exceptions to that, where it's a 2-step process. But for the most part, when the immigration law was set out, there was a requirement written in that if a company is going to seek permanent residency for someone, like it's a really, really big deal, right? The ability to live here forever. There's going to have to be a labor market test conducted in order to demonstrate that there are no willing, able, qualified U.S. workers for that position here in the United States. And that's the process that we call labor certification, or PERM. It's the first step of the vast majority of employment-based green card processes. That first step is filed with Department of Labor, not actually the Immigration Service. It's one of a few instances when Department of Labor is involved in an immigration process. And that process alone can take, 18 to 24 months pretty regularly. We've seen government processing times on PERMs creep up at various phases of the process. So it's something that, if you're interested in permanent residency through your employer or as an employer, you want to pursue that on behalf of an employee. It's something you want to give yourself a lot of runway for in terms of time, because it can take some time to conduct all 3 steps of this process. Once you have cleared the labor market test, you've demonstrated through the required regulatory measures that there are no willing, able, qualified U.S. workers for this position, and Department of Labor has certified that individual's PERM. You move on to the immigrant preference petition. That's the I-140. That's the company's actual visa petition on someone's behalf. We've now jumped back to USCIS, to the Immigration Service, and it's processed by USCIS. For a lot of folks, steps 2 and 3 cannot happen at the same time. So step 3 is the actual green card application. For folks where there is a backlog or a wait, this is another place, green card processing is another place where quotas come into play. In the immigration law, there's a limit on how many green cards can be issued in different categories in a given calendar year. or rather in a given fiscal year. For a lot of folks, those quotas are going to prevent them with moving forward with step 3 of the process at the same time as step 2. For folks from European countries, for folks from France, you're going to almost always see an ability to proceed with steps 2 and 3 fairly contemporaneously, so that those quotas and weights won't be as impactful. What determines whether or not someone's going to have a quota or a weight is the visa bulletin. This is getting into the weeds a little bit. For us immigration practitioners, it's our daily, is monitoring the visa bulletin. It comes out once a month. And this is where Department of State is monitoring the movement in the available quotas and sort of the lines that are out there for a green card process. So if the visa bulletin issued in a given month indicates that an individual is current, meaning there is an immediately available visa, there's no wait in terms, there's no backlog. We've got an example up here on the screen. Wherever you see the letter C, that is a category and a country of birth that is current for immediate green card processing. Anyone with a C can do steps 2 and 3 at the same time. Anyone with a date listed there is going to have to wait until they are at the point in the green card process where their place in line is prior to that date. So some of the most common questions we get, there are 2, is sort of what's determining first, second, third other workers, if you sort of see that leftmost column there. That's what we call preference category. And so again, the immigration law, when they sort of set everything out, they set what we call preference categories out into the law that determines the number of overall visas available within that category. And in theory, you just sort of, well, in reality, there's more available in 1 than there are in 2, more in 2 than there are in 3, and so on and so forth. In practice, sort of the demand for each of these categories can mean that that's not the order in which they move in terms of the line. But when you see EB1, EB2, EB3, that's corresponding to those columns on the visa bulletin. So EB1 is for what we call priority workers. These are folks that are going to be able to skip that perm process that I talked about a moment ago. So EB1 petitions are going to be outside of the labor market test world. EB2 and EB3, for the most part, with a narrow exception within EB2, EB2 and EB3 petitions are going to require the labor market test, with again, a small exemption in EB2. And then the way that we monitor that visa bulletin, thank you, Brian, exactly. So if you have a petition filed in EB2 and you are country of birth France, you're going to fall under all other areas of chargeability. So if you see on this visa bulletin here, there are a number of countries that are called out individually. These are countries of birth that typically have very high demand and experience a longer backlog for the green card process. These quotas are determined by country of birth in addition to preference category in combination. So if you don't see country of birth specifically enumerated, it falls into all other areas of chargeability. And so you'll see for most folks, we have current processing. We have some small backlogs very recently in the visa bulletin. We expect that to alleviate with the new fiscal year. And that's a pretty recent development, I think, as of February. We saw that, what we call retrogression. So again, this is a bit of the visa bulletin and green card weights and the process and whether you can complete sort of phases 2 and 3 at the same time. It's a bit of a moving target. It changes monthly. So for the vast majority of the time in the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen, fairly current processing for folks in all other areas of chargeability. With the most recent visa bulletin that's controlling here in the month of February, we've seen some backward movement in that and some short waits in the visa bulletin. So what sets your place in line? What's that date that you see in some of those fields? That's going to be set by the date that your perm is properly filed with DOL, assuming that the I-140 is eventually approved, or the date that the I-140 is filed if you're in a non-perm category. Yes. So this is the visa bulletin and the overall green card weight. It is something that I would say end to end. I get, the question, how long does it actually take to complete the green card process all the time? If you're in a perm-based process, I think, the perm itself, like I alluded to earlier, in most instances, you can expect it to take 1.5 to 2 years, I would say is pretty common right now. It's also going to be dependent a little bit on the industry and what the labor market test looks like. So, obviously right now, if you're in big tech, that is going to be a different reality for the labor market test at this point, with very large layoffs and things like that that are impacting that sector, that might make a labor market test a little bit more challenging. There are other industries right now that are not similarly impacted, and the labor market test might be very normal right now. So I think the perm process has variables in it. Once you clear perm, if you're in a situation where you're filing an I-140 and a green card application at the same time, that phase of the process you can expect to take, I would say, between 1 year and 1.5 years to actual green card issuance from the time that the green card application is filed. So if it's going in at the same time as the I-140, that's rough government processing times right now.
So big picture, if you are not from India or China and you're going to go through the perm process and try to get your green card, it's going to take you 2.5, 3.5 years.
Yep.
So it's not something immediate that you're going to want to do right away. So typically what you'll do is you'll come in on one of those other categories that we discussed, whether it's an H-1B, an L-1, the whole alphabet soup. So you'll have your temporary immigrant status, and then you'll pursue the green card concurrently at the same time. So for a foreign national, it can be kind of an all-consuming process, because you might have multiple cases going on. And someone was saying to me actually before this call, you're not really at peace until you receive the green card, because there's extensions and different case types and everything like that. Because you can have your non-immigrant status, you have an H, you keep extending. In the meantime, you have your perm that you're working on. But yeah, if you're not from India, China, you can get a green card in, I would say, about 3 years. So plan ahead.
Yeah, I think just to echo that, plan ahead is the real key, because we have a 3.5 year process, and we sort of talked a little bit earlier, talking about sort of the temporary or non-immigrant visa types. The L1, you might have a 5-year limit on holding L1 status. So, now if we have a 5-year limit on holding that status, we need to get somebody their green card. You need to start that process for an employee fairly early in them joining you in the United States. Same with the H-1B, a 6-year limit. There are certain ways to extend beyond that depending on where somebody is from and if they're backlogged or not. But in the end, because we are seeing a real increase in a lot of processing times, it's important to start these processes early for employees to make sure that things are in place if they do have a visa type that has a limit, for sure.
Yeah, and for folks who are going through this process, I recommend being really sort of candid about, and having open discussions about when will green card sponsorship start, and at what point will the company be willing to begin that process for me. And the reason for that is exactly as Brian and Alex just pointed out. It can be a lengthy process. If you're on an H-1B, the back half of that can be taken up by the green card process, right? So you want to make sure that you're not getting close to that 6-year maximum, and just sort of know all of your options and the expected timelines. So I recommend sort of candid early conversations about that, even if you've just moved on to your H-1B or your L-1 within the last year or two.
And it's also something that you would talk about at the recruitment phase. So even if you're just recruiting them for a non-immigrant visa, it's a good discussion to have so that expectations are clear. Especially if they've transferred over from another company, they might have already used up some of their H-1B time. For most of the companies that we see that are mid-size, small size in the Boston area, they usually have a rule where they'll have an employee be with them for at least a year before they start the green card processing. It's a big investment for a company, and they want to see, does this person have the performance metrics that we'd like to see before we actually invest in them and start the green card. So that's something to think about in terms of timing. Sometimes you just have no choice. You have to start the green card process faster because maybe they don't have enough time on their non-immigrant visa, and the company has to decide, is this somebody that we want to make an exception for? Are they really special? Do we just really want to keep them? So that's something to discuss, right at the beginning, before the person even starts working with you. Just understanding, what's the career path going to look like? You don't always know, but at least you could have internal company policies and try to be having some consistency.
Yep. So I think that's right. I think it's all part of sort of openness and candidness and sort of having a long-term plan for your immigration status. What is, where can I expect to be in this process in a year or 2 years or 5 years? So let's talk for a moment about the categories that we discussed that do not require the labor market test. So the first is those EB-1 priority workers, which is never going to require the PERM process. There are 3 subcategories of EB-1. There are a limited quantity of them, as there are all employment-based green card processes. They are limited to overall 40,000 immigrant visas in a given year. And the 3 subcategories are for individuals of extraordinary ability. This tracks very closely to the O1 visa, not precisely, but quite closely. And individuals of extraordinary ability can self-petition, or an employer can petition on their behalf. The next category is outstanding professors and researchers. And this is employer-sponsored, so this needs to be sponsored by the individual's employer. And the last is multinational managers and executives. This tracks very closely to the L1A category that Alex discussed earlier, and this also must be sponsored by an employer. Like we discussed, the labor certification is not necessary. So the benefit on any of these 3 categories is that you go directly to the I-140, and if you're not subject to a wait or a backlog on that visa bulletin, the green card application can be filed at the same time. So if you're in a situation where you're bypassing PERM, you're cutting out that first 1.5 or 2 years of processing time, you can expect, that processing time to be much closer to, 1 to 2 years, if you're in one of these buckets. And then the other category that we discussed, where you might be able to, well, this is actually, if we're touching on this slide for a quick moment. So EB2, advanced degree professionals and individual of exceptional ability. This is mostly PERM-based category, but just sort of delving into what will qualify an individual for EB2. This is either going to be advanced degree professionals, so individuals with a master's or above, or a bachelor's plus 5 years of work experience. That's how you end up in the EB2 preference category. And this is going to be, this type is going to be labor certification required. Individuals of exceptional ability, typically a labor certification required with the exception of sort of individuals in U.S. national interest. And then moving on to quickly EB3.
And just one thing to add to on EB2. So it is a little bit of a quicker line. So you'll see a lot of candidates or a lot of foreign national employees. I want EB2. Can I do EB2? I have a master's degree. I have an advanced degree. So the important thing to understand about qualifying for EB2 is the candidate is not what decides it. Their credentials are not what decides it. What decides it is what are the absolute minimum requirements for an employer for someone to fill that role. So if, say you have an entry-level role that usually just requires a bachelor's degree and not really much experience, that's not going to be EB2 even if you hire someone with a PhD. So it's a common question that we get as attorneys, or that recruiters get, or that employers get, is, can I be EB2? Will I be EB2? Because it's a little bit of a faster line, and the answer is going to depend a little bit.
And just to clarify, if you're not from India or China, EB2 versus EB3, most of the time the processing is going to be the same. So it doesn't really matter. Even if you want to feel special and be EB2, it doesn't actually impact your case.
And as I
pride aside for
yeah, right.
And as I alluded to earlier, the processing time hasn't necessarily tracked in recent years. So even if you are from India and China, we've seen actual flip-flops because perception has been, I need to be EB2 because it's faster. More individuals end up in that category, which depletes the quotas faster and actually opens up availability in EB2, and it can create this imbalance in the visa bulletin where it's intended, the way that the law was structured, intended for EB2 to move faster, and then all of a sudden you see EB3 with more advanced priority dates. So again, all this sort of, no reason to have sort of pride wrapped up in it. I think we see that a lot. I think, keeping in mind that the purpose for any perm-based, process, and it's difficult to be dispassionate about this, but the purpose is that labor market test. So it's about the job, as Brian alluded to, not the individual, right? And of course, that's the opposite is true with EB1, where it's very much, in those extraordinary ability categories, it's going to be about, the qualifications of the individual. So EB3, the last sort of perm-based category that we'll discuss, all EB3 cases are going to require a perm. This is going to be the most common. The reason for that is that, the requirements are a bachelor's degree or for an equivalent. There are, for the sort of one category within EB3, there is also a skilled worker category that requires at least 2 years of experience. So that you don't have to have a bachelor's degree if you're applying as an EB3 skilled worker. And in general, we see historically, the longest backlogs here with those limited recent exceptions where we can say that EB2 and EB3 have flip-flopped. You typically see this because this is, reflective of realistically the most open positions, right? They're going to require a bachelor's degree rather than an advanced degree, and just sort of the most demand worldwide, typically. The last thing we'll discuss is the EB5, which is permanent residence for certain investors. We'll touch on this very quickly. It is a path to permanent residency for significant investments in the United States. And so the requirement is an investment in a commercial enterprise, and the investment is very significant. So at least $1.8 million with a plan to create or preserve 10 full-time jobs for U.S. workers. And the process for this is completely sort of offline from the other employment-based options that we talked about. It's a petition with USCIS where you're demonstrating the investment, demonstrating the job creation or job preservation. That dollar amount can be lower if it's in certain areas. It's dependent. But it, again, is going to carry a very significant investment monetarily, and that you're demonstrating that job preservation. You are able to file the green card application depending on availability with that petition. Also subject to the visa bulletins, there are also sort of quotas here. And what you see is issuance of a temporary green card. There's also going to be a demonstration 2 years after issuance that those jobs are preserved or created, and then a permanent green card is issued. So this is again sort of a narrow. It's going to be available for a narrow subset of folks just because of the significant investment required, but it is a path that's there to obtain a green card.
And
That's covered a lot. I mean, it's a crash course and a lot of things that we're throwing at folks out there. So we'll be able to answer questions afterwards, or anyone online, feel free to send us a chat and we can address questions that you might have. One thing I do want to jump to from here, though, and it's a very common question, it's a very important question that we get from a lot of people, is what about my family? What about my spouse or my kids? Can they come to the United States with me if I'm transferring into the U.S.? But very importantly, they'll ask, can my spouse work based on whatever visa type that I'm going to have, being sponsored by my employer? So there's been a few updates, I don't want to say recent updates, it's been about a year now, or in the last year, there's been some significant updates on that front. So Alex, we're going to ask you to sort of walk us through work authorization for spouses, what that entails, which spouses and visa types can and cannot work, and also what some of those updates are from the last year.
Sure, thanks, Brian. So you'll see that the slides are about spouses. It's because your kids can't work. They can't do internships or anything like that. They can volunteer only if it's at a nonprofit or something like that. They can't just volunteer at a private company because they want to get the experience. So that's unfortunate for your kids. If you are the primary visa holder, you absolutely can bring your kids as long as they're under 21. So if you're trying to bring over your 19 or 20-year-old, you might want to think about, okay, well, what are the plans for them, and talk to the immigration lawyer, because they're not going to be able to just stay with you, even though a 22-year-old might seem like your kid. They're not under immigration laws. For your spouses, sometimes they can work and sometimes they cannot. It really depends on the visa category, on how difficult it's going to be. Now, it seems counterintuitive that the H-1B is like the most common visa category, but it's also one of the harder ones for the spouse to work. Your spouse would come over on H-4 status. If you are at a certain part in the green card process, which for most people will be about 2 years after you get your I-140 petition approved, then your spouse can apply for an EAD card, call it Employment Authorization Document. So it's an actual card that you get that says that it has work authorization on it. But you have to be in the United States and in the green card process for a while. So what does your spouse do in the meantime? A lot of times, maybe the spouse will come over in H-4 status, and that at least gives them time to find an employer who might sponsor them in the H-1B cap lottery or some other status. So that is a tough one. The L, that's for the intercompany transferees. That is so much easier. A recent update is that your L2 spouse has work authorization incident to status, which means they don't have to do any extra applications, no waiting time. As soon as they enter the United States, they're good to go, they can work. So that's really great for your transferring employees. These are people that have been with your company for at least a year. You want to take care of them, trying to convince them to come over, their spouse can work. So that's really good. Same thing with the E2. If you're having a startup company and you're just doing the initial investments and it's kind of risky, maybe it's hard to get people to come and, transfer over to a new country. Their spouse can work right from the get-go. They don't have to do a separate application. Really, really helpful because before spouses in L2 or E2 status, they'd have to apply for an employment authorization document. And with the pandemic, the processing times at some stages were up to 8 months. So, technically in that status, they can work, but they just don't have the right application. So I think the recent changes have really helped that. The other part of it is that there's automatic renewals. So it used to be that once your EAD expired, if you were still waiting for your next EAD to be approved, you'd have to wait for that to be, to come in. But if you have an incident to status, you don't even need to deal with that anyways. J2s, if you come in as an intern or a trainee, as a researcher, your spouse does have to apply for an EAD. So there is that wait time. They can't just come into the United States and work. Instead, they have to make an application. It's the form I-765. It's filed with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. And you have to file it while you're in the United States. You can't try to be proactive and do it before you come over. You have to come here and just know that there's going to be a period of time that the spouse is not going to be able to work until that EAD comes in and is approved. Funnily enough, the O1, which is aliens of extraordinary ability, there are these people that have done these amazing accomplishments. Maybe they have publications, media, all these things. Well, their spouses just can't work. They can go to school. That's it. You think that someone who's so special and unique, they would have more incentive, but their spouses just can't work. So sometimes what we'll see is that people might come over on an O1. Maybe they didn't get in the H-1B cap lottery, or maybe it's taking too much time. So they do the O1, and then they might switch over to another category eventually, and that'll, maybe have their spouse be able to work. But it's definitely not just the cost and complexity of the primary visa holder. It's also, what are the cost benefit analysis for their family when they're coming over.
Yeah, and I think, we saw in the last year, and it's really good news for L2, so spouses of intercompany transferees, and E2, spouses of the treaty traders or treaty investors, is one reason why the U.S. government, USCIS, basically agreed to do this is because there were very, very lengthy processing times for EADs, for the employment authorization documents. And there are visa types like the H4, the J2 that still require the EAD. But there's at least a little bit of relief for certain visa types not having to go through the EAD process. And that was because of these very significant backlogs, which we are still seeing processing times for USCIS. So Amanda, can you talk to us about these backlogs, sort of ways to potentially troubleshoot them and sort of updates on that front in terms of processing times and the lag it takes to actually get things done with USCIS?
Yes, so I think we've touched on this at a couple of different times, but there are times when in the U.S. immigration law where, overall quotas or things like that are going to create a backlog or a line. And then there are times when government processing times are just going to add to the overall length of things, right? So green card backlogs, we discussed a bit when we were discussing the visa bulletin. At in any category where there's not current processing time, that is going to be a situation where there's a backlog for green card availability. And for some folks, that might be a couple of months that they need to wait in order for their priority date to become current and to clear that backlog. For folks from certain countries of birth, most commonly we see India and China, you can see many years of backlog and waiting for that availability. And so in those instances where there is a backlog for overall green card availability, where there's going to be a gap between when someone can have their I-140 filed and when their green card application can be filed, that's a really important time to be strategizing with immigration attorneys about how are we going to bridge this time until we get somebody to green card status. And not all of the visa types that we discuss sort of maximum amounts of time, and the L1 is going to be between 5 and 7 years, depending on whether it's an L1B or an L1A, that can't be extended. If we think about the H1B, that can be extended for somebody who's backlogged and waiting for their green card availability if they've gotten that I-140 approved. So that's the same milestone for their dependent to have work authorization, or for their spouse to have work authorization, not their child, as Alex noted. But that I-140 approval and hitting that milestone in the green card process is going to hold somebody's place in the green card line. If they're in H1B and while they await that backlog to clear, and again, that could be, 10, 11 years, depending upon country of birth, and will also afford dependent work authorization once you've reached that milestone for H4. Separate from that, we see, and those are, structural backlogs that are built into just the way that the immigration law is written with these, with quotas for green cards. Separate from that is lengthy government processing times. And I think what we've experienced in the past several years is just a general lack of resources within the government that has led to long processing times, whether that's at USCIS or at the consulates abroad. I think it's a very unique confluence of circumstances that the labor market has seen in many industries, and I think the U.S. government has not been immune to it. And so that's going back to, a lot of these agencies with public servants, whether it's USCIS or Department of State consular officers, leaving the government, if we're looking, 4 or 5 years in the past, and then, the pandemic and COVID and things, just making that even worse. And what happens is when there are fewer folks to do the job, we see processing times go up. And so we've seen a couple of initiatives to help ease those processing times. So adjustment of status interview waivers. These are green card applicants. Adjustment of status is the legal term for becoming a lawful permanent resident or a green card holder. And for many, many years, folks who were applying through work had a waiver of the interview that was reversed in the prior administration. Everyone was appearing for an interview. That's a big strain on the agency, on USCIS. They had to have officers there, right, to interview every single applicant for a green card. We've seen the reinstatement of interview waivers for the vast majority of employment-based applicants. That means that, that's clearing a hurdle, obviously, not having to physically appear for an interview, having a USCIS officer available to conduct that interview. We've seen that ease up processing times. We've seen non-immigrant visa processing times. I've sort of observed them get better from their worst point, which I would say was probably a year or two ago. They're significantly better. A lot of non-immigrant visas that we talked about are eligible for premium processing. Not all of them are. So a petitioner can choose to sort of speed up adjudication. And the government is expanding availability of premium processing to a number of other categories, which we'll discuss in a moment. Another key area where we've seen extensive backlogs is in EADs. And Alex touched on this when she was talking about L2s and E3s, E3Ds that were dependent on an actual EAD card and now can work instant to their status. We're seeing across the board, whether it's an EAD that's being applied for through a green card process or as the dependent of somebody who is on a non-immigrant visa, just really long processing times from the government on these EADs. There is a very recent settlement with USCIS where they have agreed to decide applications for H4 and L2 dependent work authorization together with the principal's petition. So what we saw happening was someone files for their H1B, they move employers, let's say, from employer A to employer B. And employer B premium processes their change. So their H1B is approved in 15 days. Fantastic. They're starting their new job, super exciting. Well, their employer B has, said, sure, we'll help your dependent, your spouse, seek an EAD. We'll file that together with your H1B. Let's say that spouse has never had an EAD before, for instance. Well, they file all together and the H1B is approved in 15 days and it was taking 8, 9, 10 months for the H4 EAD to come. That's a stressful situation, particularly once you get into a situation where you're extending EAD. So someone holds an H4 EAD, their H1B spouse is extending their status as it's coming up to expiration, and the H1B principal status is expired, and the H4 EAD holder is waiting for 8, 9, 10 months to have their EAD issued, right? It was a problem for, a big problem for, I would say, the past 3 or 4 years, where these backlogs were getting worse and worse, and it was just getting very tricky for families to navigate. How do you deal with the fact that, the principal is going to have uninterrupted work authorization, and, your dependent spouse who, might be facing a gap of 2-3 months after their card expires and they're waiting for their renewal. So there was a lawsuit to this effect, and to address this issue, and USCIS settled and agreed that they will decide applications for those EADs for those dependents together with the principal application. And the great thing about this is that means that if the principal's petition is premium processed, you can expect an adjudication on the dependent's case, within that same amount of time, even though right now as it stands, and this could change very soon, but right now as it stands, you're not going to see actual premium processing eligibility for those folks. So that's a great update. It's very recent. I think it was January 24th that they started adjudicating them together, which is fantastic. And it's a big strategy thing for us as practitioners now, thinking around, if we have somebody who is in H4 working pursuant to an EAD, and we know that if they file a loan, they're going to be facing, 6 to 8 months of processing time. We think about, is there an appropriate filing for the H1B principal, and thinking through these things to sort of really reach that best strategy for the family. Because as Alex, discussed a moment ago, you're thinking of these solutions for entire family units, right? It's not just the principal visa holder. If they have a spouse that is also, work authorization dependent in the US. And so the last sort of note on this is expansion of premium processing. So the premium processing service is something that enables, a paid, faster adjudication of a petition. And traditionally it's been 15 days, and right now the fee is $2,500. The government announced, it's got to be, a year and a half ago now, that they intended to expand availability of premium processing, and it's happening very slowly, this rollout. So just recently, as of January 27th, all of the I-140 categories can be premium processed. Previously, we couldn't premium process the non-perm based petitions as readily. And so we'll be able to pursue premium processing on all of those I-140 categories. We're expected expansion to EAD applicants that are on F1 OPT, so EADs associated with OPT status after graduation. So folks who are F1 students who are seeking their their year of optional practical training and their work authorization through that mechanism, we're hopeful that their EADs will be able to be premium processed this spring, and the same for the J-based EADs that Alex discussed a moment ago. And then lastly, dependent status applications for dependents in F, J, and M are hopefully we'll expect that in May or June. So it's a slow rollout of an expansion of premium processing service, which is a great benefit. It's pricing for sure at, right now it's at $2,500. We've seen that, increase really double, I think, in the last 5 years. But a great benefit when you can leverage it.
Absolutely. And so, this is talking about backlogs that we have for folks that are typically already in the United States, trying to extend their status or get work authorization or whatever it might be. But one really important update that I just want to touch on is consular updates. So basically since March 2020, through pretty much towards the second half of last year, I have someone coming in and saying, Brian, I want to transfer this person on the L to the United States. Let's do this. And I said, okay, that's great. But they need to be able to go to an appointment at the U.S. consulate and actually get their visa and their passport. And because of COVID, and because of resource issues in the Department of State, which runs the U.S. consulates, because of protocols local to whatever country that somebody's in, there were significant backlogs in actually getting a visa appointment at the U.S. consulate. We're talking, 4 months was great. That would be like the least amount of wait you would see. And, when you're trying to get somebody in a position in the United States, 4 months is not really feasible. So we'd say anywhere from 4 months to 12 months, 13 months to 14-month waits to actually get a visa appointment at the U.S. consulates in 2020 and 2021, depending on the location. So I think I talked to FACCNE last year around this time, and this slide was abysmal, was awful. I was like, well, it's not going to go well. So the good news here is things are much, much better. And one good thing about Fragomen is, we are a global law firm. We actually do have folks across the world that work directly with U.S. consulates that are on the ground, in the UK and Australia and France, wherever it might be, that do U.S. inbound immigration, but are stationed outside the U.S. and have expertise in working with the consulate. So they're able to give me some good details and, just some key locations that, folks here would be interested in: Paris, London, Brussels, have really good availability for visa appointments to actually get your visa and be able to travel to the United States, basically in March and April 2023. A year ago, the funny thing is, a year ago in some places, this slide was the same. I'd be saying, you're going to get it in March 2023. The problem was that it's March 2022 that I was saying that. So availability is much better nowadays. It's good news. It's sort of getting out of the consular backlogs that we're dealing with, the resource issues that we're dealing with. That's not to say COVID is still impactful. So a good example of that is on almost zero notice, almost all of the U.S. consulates in China canceled appointments for all of January of 2023. They were just all canceled. People had to reschedule. People were scrambling to try and get new appointments. So COVID still is in play. It's important to keep that in mind when planning, but some good news on actually getting visas to be able to travel to the U.S. For folks in the employment-based context. One other thing that the U.S. government has instituted and implemented and has helped with being able to get visa appointments is they have an interview waiver process for actually getting your visa and your passport. So depending on your U.S. immigration history, depending on the visa type that you are applying for, depending on what country that you're from, there is the possibility to basically submit your passport by what we call Dropbox, or essentially by mail, and then you'll get it back with your visa without having to actually appear in person at the U.S. consulate. One tricky thing about this is, you do have to sort of remain in country usually for 2 to 4 weeks while it's getting processed. So sometimes folks, you schedule an appointment, you show up a couple of days before you go to your appointment at the consulate, you get your visa 2 or 3 days later, and you're out of there. So the give and take of the interview waiver and not appearing for the interview is you have to spend a longer time period in the country where you are sort of dropping your passport off. But all in all, promising news, good news in terms of availability for actually getting your visa to U.S. consulates and being able to travel to the U.S. So there's good news there.
And the one thing that I would say about the consular piece is that I think, if we're going back to sort of pre-COVID, when you could just most of the time, grab an appointment when it was convenient and plan to have, everything sort of back and your passport back in, within a week and, have a pretty short trip and really rely on that. I think it's tough sort of at this phase of things, 3 years into, post-COVID times to really still expect some impact. So even with the Dropbox, as Brian noted, it could take 2 to 4 weeks. They're also going to call Department of State has confirmed a certain number of folks will be called for in-person interviews, even if they apply through Dropbox. So remaining flexible, understanding that it can take quite some time to complete. You do need a little bit more lead time in most instances with these consulates. Compared to pre-COVID times, certainly, much, much better, as Brian noted, than a year ago. But really, planning in advance and understanding that, we're not quite back to the pre-COVID norm of, sort of a quick jaunt and getting everything stamped and having your passport back in, a matter of a couple business days and coming back to the States. So still recommending, a good amount of advanced planning and flexibility around your plans when you're needing to travel to get a visa stamp.
So we do have some questions in the chat box, which we'll get to, and then we'll take questions from anyone here in person as well. So one question, it's come from a few different folks as well, is looking at it from, the foreign national perspective and applying for jobs in the United States and sort of running into obstacles where you're asked, do I need visa sponsorship? And if I need visa sponsorship, typically an employer is not interested in actually going through that process. Sort of what might be available or tips or suggestions that might be available for those types of folks. And so I'll handle this one. One of the challenging things in the U.S. employment-based immigration system is that it is very heavily employer implemented, right? So you are relying on having a job offer with an employer. You are relying on the employer deciding to sponsor you for visa status. The employer needs to be undertaking those costs as well. Pretty much, all visa types of the permanent resident process. There are very strict rules in place that, you can't have, pay for play. I'll cover all the government costs if you sponsor me for my visa. There's typically you're not able to do that. It's against the rules. So it can be extremely challenging. Unfortunately, sometimes there isn't a good answer for, how do I go about counteracting this? One thing I will say, though, when it comes to sort of the non-immigrant and temporary work visa type is a lot of employers, and especially in the Boston area, they ask us for benchmarking. What are you seeing out there in terms of how can we make ourselves as a company competitive for great candidates? So a lot of employers are willing to go through immigration processes because they're going to lose out the candidates if they don't. And sort of, mid-sized or larger companies are typically going to undertake that because they realize that they need to do that to keep the best talent. And again, in the Boston area. There are, and especially sort of in the green card context, depending on someone's background, and the potential for essentially sort of a self-petition or self-sponsorship. We're not going to get into the details of that. It's certainly going to be sort of a per-person basis. But again, unfortunately, the U.S. system is very employer-driven. But I do think, especially 2020, 2021, 2022, with the labor market the way it is, there's still a lot of unfilled positions out there right now in certain sectors. Employers do want to be competitive in the labor marketplace, and they do undertake visa sponsorship as well. But I do admit it can be tough, and it tends to be very specific to different employers too.
Practically speaking, the two most common ways that we see people come over through the L1, try to find a company that maybe has an office in the United States. So maybe you start working for them abroad, but then they see your potential and they might transfer you over to the United States. The other way is to come here as a student. That allows you to build relationships with local employers. Maybe you can do internships, things like that. fill out the market, and then the employer may decide to sponsor you.
Yeah, and we've touched on this in other areas of the presentation, but I think being really candid and honest. So I think one of the questions was, if someone says, do I require sponsorship? Should I say yes? And if you do, yes, definitely, right? You want to be upfront about that. And there are, to Brian's point, there are, tons of companies out there that will sponsor. So what you don't want is to, not be totally forthcoming and then be stuck sort of once you're a ways through the recruitment process if there's a hurdle to sponsoring. So I would say certainly, it's so important to, we talked about this earlier, have, an open dialogue with employers about, what is sort of my future in terms of immigration sponsorship. It's a huge deal. And a lot of companies now are viewing it as, a benefit, a competitive benefit in terms of how they can structure their offerings in their immigration program to retain the best talent out there. And they understand that that's a point of competition. So I would say absolutely to be transparent about any of those needs. Yeah.
Alexander, I'm going to give this one to you. Just, we didn't really get into F1, so F1 is student visa, and there is the opportunity to potentially work for a certain period of time on what's called OPT after graduating as a student. But one of the questions we have is sort of advantages, disadvantages, really just comparing and contrasting F1 versus J1, especially for employment options while holding the status or after sort of finishing either the degree program or the J1 program.
Yeah, so probably the biggest distinction is depending on where you want to go to school. If you come here in the United States to go to school, you'll have an F1. For the J1, you have to go to school outside the United States for most circumstances to be able to even qualify for the J1 to come here. F1 can be a really good option because sometimes you can work while you're attending school, either through CPT, which is curricular practical training, or OPT, which is optical practical training. And then after you graduate, you can typically work for a year. If you're in a STEM field, then you can work for another 2 years. So that gives you 3 years of the ability to work, build relationships with employers, and maybe get an H-1B. Whereas if you're coming over on a J-1, internship's only for a year, the trainee's only for 18 months, unless you're doing some kind of research position that's 5 years. So I think it just depends, where do you want to go to school? How long do you want to be here?
And another key consideration there is, you have the flexibility for the F1. There's not that 2-year foreign residency requirement, which can be in place on the J, and that can sort of make it trickier to pursue the green card process down the line unless you are willing to relocate back for a number of years before coming back to the US. So I think it's individual circumstances always, but those are some of the pros and cons.
Another question we have, and I'll take this one, and there's a couple actually related to H4. So H4 is going to be for spouses of H-1B holders. One is there a plan to sort of implement the L2 style work authorization to H4? So again, L2 is, you don't need to apply for your EAD, your work card, you just come into the US, you can work right away. In the H4, you actually have to apply for that EAD, wait for it to come in the mail, and then your work authorized. So the answer to that right now is no. The basis for work authorization for each type is sort of in different places in our immigration regulations and immigration law. So there is no proposed change right now to not require an H4 to get an EAD. But Amanda talked a little bit about sort of that simultaneous adjudication for an H-1B holder and their H-4 spouse and the H-4 EAD. So there are sort of ways to game the system and get a quick adjudication of an H-4 EAD for your spouse. Certainly, shoot us a message afterwards or talk to counsel about it. There are ways to do it now. But the short answer to that is no. And then another question we have is, I'm an H-1B holder, I'm changing employers, my spouse is in H-4 status. Do I need to modify my spouse's H-4 in any way because I'm changing employers? And the short answer is no. An H-4 holder is not based on any employer specific for the principal H-1B holder. So no action technically needs to be taken, but the longer answer is typically what will happen is, if someone's in H-1B status and they're changing their H-1B over to a new employer B, that employer is also going to file an extension of H-4 status for the spouse, just to make sure that everyone's expiration dates are all lined up. So technically, you don't have to do anything. It can create some wonky situations down the road. best practice is to just sort of everything filed together, and most most employers and law firms.
And one note on the H4 and as compared to sort of L2s and the work authorization incident to your status, as Brian mentioned, there's sort of different bases in the immigration law for each of those categories of dependent work authorization. And the biggest hurdle, there would need to be a pretty significant change written into the law to enable that on the H4 side, because not all H4 spouses are eligible for work authorization, right? So there needs to be the H-1B, principal H-1B holder has to hold an approved I-140 in order for that H-4 dependent to become eligible to file for an EAD. So we can't just blanketly say, anyone who is an H-4 spouse can get that H-4 designation, because it's not applicable to all H-4 spouses that they're work authorized. There needs to be that additional qualification that the H-1B holder has an approved I-140.
Yeah, and then, so another question just came in too is it possible to change from an F1 into another visa status like an H-1B? And I had a slide about this, I took it out and I almost have it in every presentation, but the answer is yes. The most typical permutation of people obtaining work authorization in the United States is to come as a university student, get F1 student visa status. You can then get work authorization for usually 1 to 3 years, depending on your degree field. And then, it's sort of a trial run for employers out there. They say, great, this is a great employee, you want to sponsor them for H-1B status. And they change statuses. So it is a very common way to get long-term work authorizations, to jump from being a student in the U.S. To getting hired as a student and then changing over to a different work authorized status like H-1.
And something we've seen in recent years with the change in the way the H-1B lottery is run, where we just see these simple registrations now in the first part of March, it's becoming increasingly common for candidates to have more than one company enter them into the lottery. So if you are on an F1, you're graduating, you're interviewing with various companies, you do need to, the lottery, if you are selected in the H-1B lottery, you have to work for that particular employer that has that selected registration on your H-1B beginning on October 1st. That otherwise you can't leverage the selection. So that's an important thing to note, but that is the most common pathway is F1 to H-1B. And one of the ways that the process, sort of one of the realities of this process changes, that we do see folks have more than one company enter them into the lottery, and then they move forward with the offer with the company whose registration was selected.
Are there any questions from anyone in the room? Yes.
Quick question here. Thank you for the clear explanations already. Just to double click on the intern visas. So if we intend to have intern coming in from France to the US, what type of cost and processing times we're looking at?
So if you're going to have a J1 intern or a trainee, depending on, when they've graduated, you want to initiate that at least 3 or 4 months out before the start date. Some sponsors will require you to file the application at least a month before their visa appointment, and you want to be able to vet and everything. Every sponsor has different fees. They all have their own fee structures for what that would be, and then every law firm. But if you're going to look in aggregate, it's going to be an investment of a couple thousand. I mean, that price can vary widely, but start 4 months out, prepare to spend a couple thousand.
And one other question we have too, and I'll take this one, just asking if the e-visa is the most appropriate for a company trying to scale up and open an office in the U.S., sort of getting into the U.S. market for the first place. So it's really going to depend. Again, you're likely going to be looking at the L1 opening a new office, or potentially the E2 depending on what type of investments happening in the U.S. The one thing to keep in mind about E2s generally is, again, you have to have at least 50% ownership by that nationality. So we'll use France as an example. The French E2, the company has to have at least 50% ownership by either a French company or a French individual. And then E2 is a little bit more restrictive because the person you're then transferring to the US also has to have that same nationality, so it has to be a French citizen. You can't be a French company with an E2 registration approved and then hiring a British citizen. They're not eligible for the E2 in that way. So the L1 is definitely broader, tends to be sort of the most useful in that context. But like any lawyer, I'm just going to say the answer is it depends. But feel free to shoot us an email too. Our emails are up on the screen as well. And we do have one other question. Amanda, you have a background in finance, so I'm going to have you answer this one actually. You know, just, and I think this can be about any sector really. You know, it's a little bit specific about the question, and I think we got it before. We have it in the chat box, and we got it ahead of time too, is H-1B rules for finance rules. What to look for in sort of that sector, and you know, is it even eligible for an H-1B visa? I think it's actually a really good question that sort of gets to the heart of H-1B eligibility too.
Yep, absolutely. So certainly, I think thinking back to when we were discussing H-1Bs, so to qualify, the role needs to qualify as a specialty occupation. So the position itself has to require at least a bachelor's degree in a specific field. So if you're applying for a role as a financial analyst, and you know the position requires a bachelor's degree in finance or economics or statistics, you know that is something, and you hold that degree, that's certainly something that you could pursue an H-1B for that role. Absolutely. So I think again, it's going to be position specific. What does that position require? What credentials do you have? But yeah, absolutely, we handle H-1Bs for folks in financial roles, be it with banks or financial companies, or other companies in finance positions.
Yeah, Fragomen, we have a very large portfolio of finance-based companies. In Boston in particular, a lot of the roles that we see sponsored for H-1Bs are in financial analytics. So finance analysts, something like that. Companies are like asset management, things like that. But yeah, finance is one of the less scrutinized types of H-1Bs. Sometimes tech center, computer science can be a little bit harder for the H-1B, but finance actually is very well positioned for this category.
And then just touch on sort of the last two. So someone asking, PhD graduate, biomedical sciences, looking for a position, non-postdoc, what type of visas can I apply for? So I do think it's going to depend, but a lot of the visa types that we just covered in our discussion over the last hour and a half or so, chances are be a decent fit. And again, as someone holding a PhD, holding an advanced degree, up to potentially including the O1 visa type, depending on the type of work that they're going, depending on the person's background, depending on what they're getting into. So I do think it could run the gamut. It's going to depend on the role that someone's looking for, in terms of what type of job they're looking for. It's going to depend on what type of maybe specific research they've done, citations, peer review, those types of things. So we won't get into the nitty gritty of that, but certainly talk to us. Feel free to reach out to us, and we can talk to folks about it.
And J1 researcher is a really good option if you have a PhD. As long as you're going to be doing some kind of research position, we see a lot of that. And then that can maybe lead to H-1B or O1, but that's the easiest to qualify for, because with the H-1B, you have to be selected in the lottery. So if you have an immediate position, the J1 researcher, that can be for companies in the private sector.
And then in terms of, Brian touched on this briefly when he was mentioning citations or publications, things like that. Whenever we see, PhD would be something we would want to vet an O, just that O1, J1 researcher, of course. But I think, it's worth looking at O1 criteria to see what the portfolio of citations and publications and original work is out there. And then on the green card side, if I think that this question mentioned biomedical sciences, there's always the possibility that you could be looking at a national interest waiver, which is one of those non-perm based green card processes. So all things that we would want to vet. And again, going to be really case specific, but certainly some good options out there.
And then the last question we have, does an H4 visa without an EAD give someone an edge over candidates that don't have a visa? Amanda, I'll take that one.
So if you're seeking employment, someone in H4 needs the EAD in hand in order to be work authorized. So, that is, again, as we mentioned, it's not one of the categories that is dependent work authorization incident to status. That would be, for the L2s or the E3, dependents. For H4s, you have to have that EAD card in hand in order to be work authorized. So, and again, in order to qualify for that EAD, the principal H-1B holder has to have an approved I-140.
So those are all the questions that I see. Any other questions for anyone in the room?
Yeah. Either you have a G1 trainee or the intern, can you apply after that to a H1B, or you have to choose between the two?
So you can apply in the H-1B lottery, depending on the program. There might be different strategies for it, but there's nothing that prevents a person from entering in the cap lottery. Sometimes they'll be subject to a two-year home residency rule, which can complicate the case. Other times, the J1 sponsor might be not too pleased to see that you're ending your internship early to switch over to another status. So, but there's different ways that you can get around that, filing consular. So yeah, it's a possibility.
Well, thank you, everybody,
Thank you.
for attending.
Thank you.
This was
Thank you very much.